want to welcome you to our study of the Bible this year, The Word in a Year. So as we've been going through the various books of the Bible thus far, we followed largely a chronological pattern, meaning that each book fit into a timeline that began in Genesis and then worked forward to the present. So this week, we're going to be examining the book of Job. And by many scholars' calculations, this is possibly the oldest book that we have in the Bible. And it follows the book of Esther canonically, so in our Bible, so in terms of its placement. But it's actually set in a time period that is more in line with the time of Abraham, which we talked about way back, kind of at the beginning of this journey through the Bible in the book of Genesis. So there's a few interesting things to point out about this book. The first is that it doesn't occur within the context of the covenant that Yahweh had with Israel. In fact, depending on how you actually date this book, you could even say that this happens before the Abrahamic covenant that Yahweh had established with Israel and its forefather Abraham. Because this predates Jacob, there's no connection between Job and the nation of Israel, period. So Job, he lives in a land called Uz. And where this exactly is, it's debatable. Most scholars think that it was somewhere probably in the proximity of modern-day Syria or Jordan. In spite of some of the questions that this book leaves unanswered, there are also a number of things that we do know about Job. We know that Job, he honors Yahweh. We know that he has great blessings, and we know that his righteousness is enough to cause Satan to notice his dedication to Yahweh as well. So all of these play into the story that unfolds through this book that we're going to talk about this evening. If we divide this book of Job up, we discover that there are really four major parts to it. The first part, the largest part of this book, it fills up, I should say, one of these parts. But there's four parts. The first part is the prologue. The second part of the book of Job is Job and his friends, their conversations. The third is God's response. And then the fourth part is the epilogue. The prologue to the book of Job, it introduces this man named Job. Job is a righteous man. He's blameless and upright, the author says, before the Lord. And the book says that he feared God and he turned away from evil. We also learn that Job has been blessed greatly. His possessions are great. His family is great. Job is a man with everything to lose. So after we learn about Job and his blessings and his righteousness, we also learn that someone else has taken notice of Job, Satan. And the scene moves to the throne room of God in heaven. And there we see on a particular day a number of spiritual beings. They come to present themselves to God. And among them was Satan, which in Hebrew means the one opposed. So as Satan comes before God, God presents Job as an upright and a righteous man. And Satan's rebuttal is that the only reason that Job is upright and righteous is because of the blessings that God has given him. So God allows the hedge of protection that's around Job to be lowered. And we find that Satan attacks Job in a number of ways. One way in which he attacks Job, the first way, is that he begins taking away the blessings that God has given to him, the blessings that he had in his life. He destroys his property. He takes away his children. And when that's not enough, Satan attacked Job's physical body. He allows a skin disease that causes boils to appear all over his body. And the Bible says this. It says that in all of this, Job did not sin. He did not utter a curse against God. And that sets up the framework for what follows in the rest of this book. The larger question that this book attempts to answer is, does God allow good people to suffer for injustices? Is God's justice mean he rewards and punishes based on our behavior? And then if good people do suffer, does that mean that God himself isn't just? So these are the questions that we will get to eventually. So word of Job's afflictions, it spreads. And because of this, he has visitations from several friends. Maybe we would use the word friends in quotes because they don't necessarily act like good friends. There's actually 4 friends who chime in their various ideas of Job's current state. Chapters 3 through 37 are full of a large amount of dense Hebrew poetry that helps the reader visualize this intense debate between Job and his friends. So there are these 4 friends we mentioned, and they all meet with Job. We have Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu. The first 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they reason that God orders the world according to retributive justice. So, in other words, if you are wise and you honor God, he rewards you. If you're foolish and you disobey God, he punishes you. It's a retribution that occurs in your life due to your behavior. So based on this ordering of the world, their assumption is that Job must have been disobedient to have received the affliction in his life that he received. Well, Job, he attempts to defend his integrity. He swears his innocence. He agrees with their worldview of retributive justice, but since he believes he's innocent, he believes that God is punishing him without cause. So Job's friends, they disagree with him, and they keep on insisting that Job must have done some sort of evil. And there are these 3 cycles of this back and forth, until Job decides he's going to take up his plea with God directly. He says, I'm going straight to the top. So in this passionate prayer, Job accuses God of being against him. He realizes that he can't be right, though, because God must be fair and all-powerful, but he still can't quite reconcile why all of these terrible things have happened to him. So Job, he demands that God explain himself. And at the end of this section, we find this youngest of the friends who chimes in, Elihu, and he responds with his take. And he has a bit more complex conclusion about why people suffer. He believes that God may use suffering for either a warning or for the building of character. But in either case, he believes that Job has no right to judge God. In the next section, we find this turn of events. God visits Job in a powerful storm, and he responds directly to him. And there's a number of rhetorical questions that God asks, and it exposes Job's lack of understanding in general of the world. And God's questions, they quickly dismantle many of Job's assumptions about justice. And they prove that the world is far more complicated than he can even comprehend. So while the world is good, it's not always safe, and does not always operate as humans assume. So by the end of God's speech, Job's convinced that he would not even understand God's answer. And Job admits his narrow thinking that led him to accuse God of injustice. So even without full knowledge of how God orders the universe, Job says he can still trust God's wisdom and God's good character. So the book ends with an epilogue. What do we find about Job? It shows how God restores Job's losses and defends his character before his friends. And their definitions of injustice, they were incorrect. And Job spoke truthfully about who God is. So while Job didn't understand God's ways, he was right to trust completely in him. So what can we learn from this book? There are a number of things that we learn from the book of Job. The bigger picture is that it points to a God who's always acting with goodness and justice, including times when people are experiencing or causing pain. Suffering does not always mean that one is receiving divine punishment. Suffering in our world is a much more complex thing. It also shows that there are times when God works even when we can't perceive it. One of my favorite verses out of this book, it states how about how Job could not perceive God at work on his right hand, but while he can't perceive that God's at work on his right hand, he perceives that he's working on his left hand. We don't always see directly what God is doing. We expect him to work with his powerful right hand, but there are times when he works in our life. He works in ways we cannot perceive and we do not understand. You see, God is ambidextrous. In other words, he moves in both direct and indirect ways that we may or may not completely understand. So finally, how can we see Jesus in this book? Well, we can see that both Job and Jesus, they experienced sufferings, even when they didn't deserve it. Job, he did nothing, to deserve the suffering that occurred in his life. And in a similar way, Jesus suffered for us, yet being without sin. Second is the idea of restoration. Job, he experiences a restoration of all that he had by the end of this book. And in a similar way, Jesus restores and makes whole the brokenness of humanity by putting back together the broken relationship that we had with God at one time. So that concludes our study for this evening of the book of Job. Next week we move into the poetry portion of the Old Testament with the books of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.